Welcome to the Mystery and Horror Channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The House with Yellow Windows. On the outskirts of town, there was a house everyone avoided. It was an old structure with peeling paint and yellow-framed windows that seemed to glow ominously as the sun set. It was said that a family once lived there but had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Over time, the house became known as the House with Yellow Windows, with stories ranging from ghostly apparitions to shadows seen passing by the windows, even when no one was inside. One night, a few friends and I decided to visit the house. The idea was to prove that the legends were just stories meant to scare children. We brought flashlights and, with hearts pounding harder than we would admit, pushed through the creaky, rusted gate that groaned under the wind's touch. The garden was overgrown with wild weeds and plants that had spread uncontrollably, forming a labyrinth of shadows that danced under the moonlight. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. I pushed it open slowly, and the sound echoed through the dark hallway. The air smelled of old wood and dampness, and our flashlights revealed furniture covered in dusty sheets and walls stained with mold. We walked in silence, the creaks of the floorboards under our feet sounding louder than they should have. Suddenly, one of us, Marcos, pointed to the staircase leading to the second floor. At the top, something briefly shimmered as if a shadow had moved. I looked up, but all I saw was darkness. A shiver ran down my spine, and I insisted that we should leave, but Marcos's curiosity got the better of him. He began to climb the stairs cautiously, and we followed, holding our breath. The upstairs hallway was long, lined with doors on either side. The first door on the right was slightly open, and Marcos pushed it. The room was empty except for an old armchair facing the window. When our flashlights illuminated the chair, we froze. Deep scratches marked the arms of the chair as if clawed repeatedly. And then we heard it. A faint sobbing sound came from the hallway, soft and drawn out, as if someone was weeping. I turned quickly and saw a shadow move from one end of the hallway to the other, disappearing into the room at the far end. Marcos muttered that we should get out, but before we could move, all the doors slammed shut simultaneously with a force that made the whole house tremble. The sobbing turned into laughter, soft and childlike, echoing from all around. Our flashlights flickered, and for an instant, I saw a pale, distorted face reflected in the window, sunken eyes and a smile that stretched impossibly wide. We bolted down the stairs, stumbling and pushing each other as the laughter grew louder. When we reached the front door, it was shut tight as if someone on the other side was holding it. We pushed with all our strength until it finally gave way, throwing us outside. We fell onto the garden, and as I looked back, I saw the shadow of a child in the upstairs window watching us. No one spoke a word on the way home. The next morning, we tried telling other friends, but the look of disbelief and fear on their faces made us realize our story sounded impossible. Yet everyone who passed by that house swore that on the darkest nights, they could see the yellow windows glowing and hear a faint giggle, as if the house still kept the echoes of those who dared to enter. Story 2. The Statue in the Garden. When my grandparents moved into an old house in the countryside, I was fascinated by it. The garden was expansive, filled with wildflowers and tall trees that cast dancing shadows in the late afternoon. But what caught my attention the most was a stone statue that stood in the center of the garden. It was of a woman in a long, flowing dress, with eyes sculpted so intricately they seemed to follow anyone who passed by. My grandmother said the statue had been there for as long as she could remember, but she didn't know where it had come from. Over time, I noticed that the statue seemed to change positions. Sometimes its arms, usually crossed over its chest, appeared to have shifted slightly. Other times, the head, which typically looked down, seemed to lift as if watching something far off. My grandparents laughed when I told them, saying I had a vivid imagination. But at night, lying in bed, I could swear I heard a faint sound of stones scraping, like the statue moving around the garden. One night, when everyone was asleep, I woke up to a soft noise, like footsteps on the grass outside my window. I got up slowly and pulled back the curtains. The moon cast light over the garden, creating long, mysterious shadows. The statue, which normally stood in the center, was now closer to the house. Its stone eyes were fixed on my window, and the once neutral mouth now seemed slightly open. Fear rooted me to the spot, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. When I finally moved to wake my grandparents, I heard a faint tapping on the glass, as if something or someone was trying to get in. I ran to their room and my grandmother woke up, startled. I told her what I had seen, but when we looked out her window, the statue was back in its usual spot, unmoving. The next morning, I convinced my grandfather to inspect the statue with me. He laughed and joined me in the garden, examining the stone figure in the sunlight. When I touched its base, I noticed scratch marks on the ground as if it had been dragged. My grandfather grew serious and said it was just wear from time, but there was a glimmer of concern in his eyes. That night, the noise returned, louder and clearer. Heavy footsteps and a continuous scraping that seemed to come from beneath my window. I got up and looked outside. The statue was now leaning against the house, so close I could see details I hadn't noticed before, like a small crack at the corner of its mouth and eyes that appeared deeper and darker. My heart raced and I couldn't move. Then I heard a whisper, low and hoarse, "Let me in." I screamed and my grandparents rushed into my room. When they turned on the light, the statue was back in the center of the garden, but now with one difference. The crack at the mouth was wider, almost forming a smile. A few months later, we decided to move after my grandfather finally admitted he too heard the footsteps and saw shadows moving in the garden at night. The house was sold and we never returned. But years later, I heard that the new owner had moved the statue to a shed at the back of the property. Even so, neighbors claimed that on full moon nights, they could hear footsteps and see a slender stone figure walking through the garden, looking for a new window to knock on. Story 3. The Mirror That Reflected Shadows. When I moved into an old apartment, I knew it came with a history. It was a 1920s building with high ceilings and wooden details that whispered stories of a bygone era. During the move, I found a large mirror left behind by the previous owner, hanging in the living room. The frame was ornate, with carved figures that looked like faces hidden within the scrollwork. Something about the mirror unsettled me, but I decided to keep it, thinking it added character to the space. In the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened, apart from a faint sense of discomfort when I passed the mirror at night. The streetlight cast strange reflections that seemed to shift. I chalked it up to my imagination until one night, I awoke to a soft scratching noise, like something scraping against glass. I got up, still groggy, and went to the living room. The dim light from the street shone on the mirror, and for a moment, I saw something that made me stop. A tall, thin shadow stood next to my reflection, but the room was empty. I blinked and the shadow was gone, but the fear lingered like a tangible presence. The following night, it happened again. This time, the scratching was louder and persistent. When I reached the living room, the mirror looked foggy, as if someone had breathed on it from the inside. Faint marks, like fingers dragging across the glass, were visible. Panic set in, and I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door and leaving the lights on. I told a friend about the occurrences and he laughed, attributing it to my nerves. Determined to prove something strange was indeed happening, he agreed to stay over. We stayed up talking and laughing until the scratching sound started once more. His laughter faded and his face went pale. We looked at the mirror and saw, with terrifying clarity, a figure trapped behind the glass, pressing its hands against the surface and mouthing words we couldn't hear. Fear paralyzed me. The shadowy figure had metallic gray eyes and seemed desperate to escape. The glass quivered as if about to shatter. My friend broke the silence, urging us to get rid of the mirror. The next morning, the daylight made everything seem less sinister. We decided to take the mirror off the wall and dispose of it. When we lifted it, a yellowed piece of paper fell from the frame. I picked it up and read the delicate, spidery handwriting, "Look only once. They come on the second." My heart raced, and we hauled the mirror to the nearest dumpster without looking back. For weeks, relief washed over me, but the quiet in the living room felt unnatural. Later, I learned from an elderly neighbor that the former owner had brought the mirror from a demolished house that once belonged to a famed medium known for her experiments with the spirit world. The previous owner had been found dead in front of the mirror, eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Since then, I avoid antique mirrors. And when I walk past the dumpster on the street, I sometimes feel a gaze on me as if waiting for me to glance back. The scratching hasn't returned, but that trapped figure still haunts my dreams, reminding me that there are doors one should never open, even in reflections. Story 4. The Room of Clocks. When I visited my great-aunt for the first time in years, I was struck by her home. It was a grand Victorian house with turrets, carved beams, and stained glass windows. The place had an air of antiquity that both fascinated and unsettled me. One room in particular had always intrigued me since childhood: the Room of Clocks. My great-aunt was a collector of antique clocks, and that room was filled with them: grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, wall clocks, all stopped, showing different times. On this visit, something felt different. The air in the clock room was heavier, as if time itself had taken on a physical weight. My great-aunt, with her white hair and trembling hands, warned me not to go into that room at night. She said it with a serious look, but I brushed it off as one of her many peculiarities. That night, as everyone slept, a low, almost imperceptible ticking sound echoed through the house. I lay in bed, trying to ignore it, but the ticking grew louder, multiplying until it felt like all the clocks in the room were ticking in unison. I got up and followed the sound down the dimly lit hallway to the partially open door of the clock room. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass window, casting moving shadows across the floor and walls. When I stepped inside, I saw that all the clock hands were moving, each on its own time. The ticking was deafening, a cacophony of mismatched rhythms. My eyes were drawn to a large, imposing grandfather clock that hadn't worked for years. Its pendulum swung slowly, and the hands spun until they stopped sharply at midnight. A suffocating silence fell. A shiver ran up my spine when a voice, raspy and low, whispered near my ear, "Time is trapped here." I spun around, but no one was there. In the glass of the grandfather clock, I saw a reflection that chilled me. A tall, featureless figure, a shadow with no details, only a dark outline that seemed to smile. Before I could react, the sound of a single ticking resumed, followed by all the clocks chiming at once, creating a metallic, mournful wail. My legs weakened, and I clutched a table for support. The shadow in the reflection moved, extending a long, twisted hand towards me. With a strangled cry, I bolted out of the room and slammed the door shut. The sound stopped instantly. My great-aunt appeared in the hallway, eyes wide. She didn't ask what happened. She only whispered, almost to herself, "They've woken again, haven't they?" Without waiting for a response, she locked the door with a key I'd never seen before. The next morning, she explained in a trembling voice that the Room of Clocks had belonged to her grandfather, a man obsessed with time, who claimed to have discovered a way to trap it. When he died, the clocks never kept the same time again, as if each one held a fragment of time he tried to control. I left my great-aunt's house with the sound of those clocks still echoing in my head. To this day, when I hear the ticking of an old clock, I feel watched, as if something is waiting for the moment when time will be set free. Story 5. The Path Through the Forest. My town was surrounded by dense forests, with trails that wound between ancient trees. One of these trails, known as the Forest Path, had a strange reputation. People claimed that at night, the forest seemed to move, and those who dared to walk it after dark would hear whispers and footsteps that weren't their own. I never believed those stories until one evening when my friend Tomas and I decided to take the path as a shortcut to a friend's house. The full moon lit up the sky, casting a silvery glow over the leaves and creating shifting shadows in the wind. At first, we laughed and joked about the tales our grandparents told, but soon the laughter faded into silence. The air grew colder than it should have been, and the feeling of being watched intensified with each step. Suddenly, we heard a twig snap behind us. We stopped and looked back but saw only darkness among the trees. Tomas muttered that it was probably just an animal, but his voice was shaky. We continued walking, but the sound of footsteps followed, echoing ours, only heavier and deliberate. Each time we paused, the steps would stop. My heart pounded, and we exchanged a nervous glance. I whispered that we should run, and Tomas nodded, swallowing hard. Before we could take another step, a slow, deep voice surrounded us. "Why have you come?" The question boomed like thunder, and the forest seemed to darken. Tomas screamed and bolted down the trail, and I followed, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The footsteps behind us grew louder, gaining speed. In a moment of panic, I tripped over a root and fell. I looked up to see a figure standing in the shadows of the trees, tall, cloaked in darkness that swallowed the moonlight. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, two pale, glowing points, were fixed on me. The voice echoed in my mind, this time softer but more threatening. "You shouldn't have come." Tomas ran back to pull me up, and we sprinted together until the lights of the town came into view. When we reached the edge of the forest and collapsed on the park grass, the footsteps stopped, leaving only the sound of our ragged breaths. We glanced back, and for a brief moment, I saw the figure at the trail's entrance before it melted into the forest. Tomas and I never spoke of that night again, but we avoided the forest path from then on. Others continued to report whispers and watchful figures, but no one believed them, dismissing it as echoes of old stories. Yet on full moon nights, I can still hear the heavy footsteps and the whisper that asks, "Why have you come?" I know now that the forest holds secrets best left undiscovered, waiting for those who dare to challenge its shadows. Story 6. The Painting in the Basement. When I inherited my great-uncle's house, I expected to find many curious relics. He had been an eccentric man, passionate about art and old stories. The house was large, with narrow hallways and a basement he always kept locked. I'd grown up hearing that the basement held his most treasured items, but no one in the family knew exactly what was there. After his death, I decided to explore every corner of the house, leaving the basement for last. With an old key in hand, I descended the creaky stairs, the scent of mold and dust growing stronger. The basement door opened with a drawn-out creak, revealing a space full of boxes, shrouded furniture, and an eerie silence. In the far corner, a large canvas covered by a white cloth caught my attention. As I approached, a chill swept over me, making the air feel colder. I lifted the cloth and stepped back instinctively. It was an oil painting of a woman in a black dress, with hollow eyes and a barely there smile that conveyed discomfort. Her eyes seemed to follow anyone who looked at her, and the background was dark, with shadowy forms that looked like distorted faces. The lower corner of the painting bore a signature I didn't recognize, dated 1897. That night, as I prepared for bed, a muffled sound came from the basement, a faint scratching like something clawing to get out. I walked downstairs with a flashlight, my hands shaking. When I opened the basement door, the sound stopped, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The painting stood as I had left it, yet something was different. The woman's smile seemed sharper, and her eyes had a gleam I hadn't noticed. I covered the painting and turned to leave, but I heard a whisper that seemed to emanate from the canvas. "You found me." Terror flooded me, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the persistent scratching, like nails scraping wood. The next morning, I called an antique dealer to appraise the painting. When he arrived and saw it, his face turned pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice unsteady. I explained it was in the basement, and he shook his head slowly. "This is known as the Lady of Shadows. The artist who painted it went mad and vanished soon after completing it. Everyone who has owned it reported hearing whispers and seeing shadows move on their own. He advised me to get rid of it immediately, but I couldn't simply throw it away. I sold it to a collector who was intrigued by its history. The scratching stopped, and the house became quiet again. But a few nights later, I received a call from the collector. Breathless and panicked, he said he needed to return the painting. He claimed the woman now stared at him with an intent that felt threatening, and the whispers had grown louder, calling his name. I hung up, a shiver running down my spine. I glanced at the basement door, still locked, but I knew that whatever presence the painting had brought wasn't truly gone. To this day, I avoid the basement at night, and when the wind howls, making the walls creak, I can almost hear that distant whisper, "You found me." Story 7. The Voice from the Abandoned Well. When I was a teenager, my family moved to a house in a rural area surrounded by fields and forests. In the backyard, there was an old well made of moss-covered stones, topped with a heavy iron lid that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. The neighbors didn't speak much about it, but when they did, it was always with a note of warning. Stay away from the well at night. At first, I thought it was just another silly superstition, but something about the way they said it made me uneasy. One afternoon, while exploring the yard, I approached the well and ran my fingers over the cold, rough metal of the lid. An inexplicable shiver ran down my spine. The air around it seemed denser, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the area. I shook off the feeling and walked away, but that night things changed. I awoke in the middle of the night to a faint sound coming from outside. I opened my window and looked out at the moonlit yard, but everything was still. Just as I was about to close the window, I heard a soft voice calling my name. I went back to bed, my heart racing, convincing myself it was just the wind. But the following night, the voice returned, louder and clearer. "Help me," it said, so close it felt like it was at the foot of my bed. I bolted upright and rushed to my parents' room, but they were sound asleep. The clock read 3:33, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Over the next few days, the voice came back every night, always at the same time. One evening, I couldn't take it any longer and decided to confront my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the well. The lid was heavier than before, but with a surge of adrenaline, I managed to push it aside, revealing a deep, dark void. The flashlight barely penetrated the blackness, and the smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic wafted up. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The echo of my question faded, replaced by a profound silence. Then, faintly, I heard shallow, labored breathing rising from the well. "Help me," the voice repeated, now desperate. I stared into the darkness, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something shift, a shadow writhing against the stone walls. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a light tug on my shirt, as if invisible fingers were trying to pull me down. I screamed and stumbled backward, pushing the lid closed and running back to the house, tripping over the uneven ground. I locked the door behind me and collapsed to the floor, the echo of that raspy breathing still in my ears. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the well's lid, as if fingers had tried to pry it open from the inside. I told an older neighbor what had happened, and he turned pale and crossed himself. He said that many years ago, a woman had mysteriously disappeared, and the well was the last place they'd searched. Some believed her spirit was trapped, calling for help on the darkest nights. I avoided the well from then on. Even now, decades later, when I visit that house, I steer clear of it. On nights when the wind howls and makes the iron lid creak, I can still hear that whisper, an echo that never truly fades. "Help me." Story 8. The Shadow on the Old Bridge. On the outskirts of town stood an old stone bridge, built over a century ago across a river winding through the forest. Locals whispered that at night, a shadow would appear on the bridge, vanishing as quickly as it came. Some claimed it was the ghost of a man who drowned there many years ago, while others said it was just a trick of light and water. I'd always enjoyed spooky tales but never believed them, until one night when I dared to cross the bridge alone. The sky was overcast, starless, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp at the bridge's edge, casting restless shadows across the stone. The sound of the river beneath was soothing, but the silence of the surrounding forest was suffocating. I walked slowly, trying to shake the feeling that unseen eyes were on me. Halfway across, the lamp flickered one last time and went out, leaving me in darkness. The sound of the rushing water seemed to grow louder, merging with a faint whisper that surrounded me. "You shouldn't have come." My heart raced, and I spun around to see if someone was there, but the bridge was empty. The whisper came again, closer. A chill crept up my spine, and an unnatural cold settled over me, as if a ghostly hand had touched my neck. When I turned back, I saw a shadow at the far end of the bridge. It was tall and thin, its edges blending seamlessly into the dark. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of my mind, but it remained, now a few steps closer. I started to back away, careful not to make noise, but each step I took seemed to echo, drumming against the stone. The shadow moved, gliding along the ground as though floating. A wave of panic crashed over me and I ran, but no matter how far I sprinted, the bridge seemed to stretch endlessly. The voice came again, this time as an inner whisper that reverberated in my mind. "You can't escape." The shadow appeared in front of me, blocking the path. Its eyes were two white orbs, featureless yet piercing through me. The cold deepened and my legs gave out beneath me. Before darkness engulfed me completely, I heard a faint laugh, thin and echoing along the bridge. When I awoke, the sun was rising and I was lying on the riverbank, my clothes soaked and body shaking. No one could explain how I got there, and I couldn't recall how I managed to leave the bridge. After that night, I never went near it again. But others who ventured there swore they saw the same shadow and heard the same whispers. It's said that on moonless nights, the shadow waits for someone daring enough to cross, never letting them forget the terror that lingers once they do. Story 9. The Doll in the Tea House. My grandmother owned a tea house on the outskirts of a small town, a cozy place filled with antique furniture, shelves lined with porcelain cups, and warm lanterns hanging from the ceiling. At the back of the shop, on a shelf that no one used anymore, there sat a porcelain doll that always sent a chill down my spine. Its face was finely painted, with a faint smile and bright blue eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked by. People said the doll had belonged to the tea house's original owner, but no one knew exactly how it ended up there. One evening, as I helped my grandmother close up, I heard a muffled giggle coming from the back of the room. I paused, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound stopped, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I glanced at the shelf, and the doll appeared to have shifted position. Its head, usually tilted slightly, was now facing me directly. I shook my head and laughed nervously, convinced it was my imagination. That night, I woke up to the sound of movement in the kitchen. I tiptoed down the stairs, the cold floor creaking under my feet. The door to the tea house, which connected to the main house, was ajar, and a dim light glowed from within. I heard the giggle again, clearer this time. I stepped into the tea house and noticed one of the lanterns swaying, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The doll at the back of the room was now sitting differently, with one arm stretched out as if inviting someone over. I took a step back and the sound stopped. Silence filled the room, broken only by a light scraping noise, like something dragging across the wood. Then, without warning, the doll toppled off the shelf and rolled to my feet, landing face up. Its blue eyes glistened in the dim light. Fear locked me in place and my breath caught in my throat. The whisper that followed sent me sprinting back to my room and locking the door behind me. "Play with me." The next morning, I told my grandmother. She listened quietly, her face grave. She said that years ago, the tea house's original owner, a woman named Beatrice, had been known to speak to herself and laugh when no one was there. After her death, the doll was found in her usual seat, untouched ever since. In the days that followed, the tea house felt different. Customers mentioned a strange, heavy atmosphere and claimed they heard laughter when the shop was empty. My grandmother decided to get rid of the doll, calling an antique dealer to take it. He took it away, promising to handle it properly. But that night, the doll reappeared at the tea house door as if it had returned on its own. After that, my grandmother locked the doll in a basement cabinet and the giggles stopped. But the air in the tea house was never the same. Even now, when I pass by, I feel a chill run through me. On quiet nights, I could swear I still hear a faint whisper coming from the basement, inviting someone to play. Story 10. The Pocket Watch. My grandfather was a mysterious man, full of stories from his youth that he rarely shared. But he always carried one thing, a golden pocket watch worn by time. He claimed it was special, a gift from an old friend who had a profound knowledge of time. When he passed away, the watch was left to me in his will. I thought it would be a sentimental keepsake, but soon discovered it held something more. The first night I kept the watch in my room, I woke to a metallic ticking that filled the air. I glanced at the watch on my dresser, seeing the hands moving at an unnaturally fast pace, marking non-existent hours. When I touched it, the ticking stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence. I put it back and tried to sleep, dismissing it as a strange dream. The next night, the ticking returned, louder this time, accompanied by a faint whisper, a distant voice saying, "Time is not your friend." I sat up, my pulse racing, and picked up the watch. It was warm, almost burning, and the hands spun so fast they blurred. Before I could drop it, the room seemed to press in on me, the air thickening. Moonlight from the window illuminated a corner where a shadow shifted. The shadow was human-shaped, tall and thin, with unnaturally long arms. It stood still, watching, and the whisper repeated, more forcefully, "Time takes its toll." I dropped the watch, and it hit the floor with a heavy thud as the shadow vanished. The silence was deafening, but the ticking lingered in my mind. I told a close friend, who suggested taking the watch to an antique dealer. The dealer, an elderly man with knowing eyes and calloused hands, paled when he saw it. "This isn't just any watch," he said. "It's a rare piece tied to a legend of a clockmaker who believed he'd found a way to access a time beyond ours. They say those who own it are haunted by the cost time demands." Unsure of what to do, I returned home with the watch and locked it in a box in the basement, hoping it would end the strange events. But that night, the ticking rose through the floor, echoing beneath me, followed by a voice that whispered through the walls, "Time never forgets." Panicking, I rushed to the basement and opened the box. The watch was gone. I looked around and saw, in the darkest corner, the shadow from before. It raised one long arm, and the ticking stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence, as though something fundamental had shifted. The next morning, the watch was back on my dresser, its hands pointing precisely to 3:33. Since then, it has never worked properly. And although I've tried to get rid of it, the watch always returns. The whispers and the shadow have ceased, but the air around the watch still hums, as if time itself waits, patient and unforgiving, to claim what it believes is due. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.